The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Greetings from Albuquerque, New Mexico, and welcome to another 1615 webinar. I'm Matthew Ellison, the president at 1615, and I also serve as a 1615 church missions coach. I want to thank you for joining us today for this very important topic. Before we begin the webinar, I want to let you know about some upcoming events at 1615. We offer webinars throughout the year on a number of relevant and critical missions topics. On March 22nd at 12 noon Mountain Time, we'll be doing a webinar on stewardship. What is our role and responsibility, specifically as it relates to the Great Commission? It's been said that all of the resources necessary to send and support an army of joy-spreading, sacrificing ambassadors is already in the church, but we're not giving it. So in this webinar, we'll talk about how to leverage the resources God has given the church in order to extend the gospel to the ends of the earth. It will be led by Virgil Dugan of the Harris Foundation and also John Moore of John Moore and Associates. Then on April 19th, 2017, also at noon Mountain, we have a webinar entitled Reaching the Nations Right Here, Right Now with Joan Lash from International Students Incorporated. Like never before, we have these amazing opportunities to engage cross-culturally, even within the confines of our own borders. And so in this webinar, we'll learn how to engage with international students and extend the gospel to all cultures. Also, I want to let you know about the mission table. If you're not familiar with the mission table, it started 2 years ago. We'll soon be filming our 3rd season, but we have some webinars and episodes that will be coming up in the next several months. The mission table was born out of an idea that a lot of churches aren't doing missions well because they're not thinking about missions well. And so we gather leading missions thinkers. We tackle critical and controversial missions topics. Please visit missiontable.org, missiontable.org to learn more, to watch archive episodes, or to register for upcoming episodes. So today's webinar is entitled Written Missions Policy, an essential tool for local churches desiring global impact. As a church, have you ever thought about having a written missions policy and why it is so important? This webinar is designed to help local churches understand the why, the what, and the how of developing a written missions policy that will free up, not bind up, their global missions endeavors. Today's subject matter expert is Jeff Jackson. He serves as the Director of Church Relations and Missionary Care at Shepherd Staff Missions Facilitators. He is also the ministry's founder and a longtime friend of mine. Shepherd Staff exists to serve and empower local churches in their efforts to send and care for their own members who've been called to serve as missionaries in countries outside the United States. In just a moment, I'm going to hand the microphone over to Jeff, but first, a couple of details for our audience. Your phones are muted to preserve sound quality. You can listen through your computer speakers or you can call in on the telephone. As questions come to mind today, please type them in the question and answer panel located in the GoToWebinar task panel on the upper right-hand side of your screen. We will be addressing your questions for the last 15 to 20 minutes of our time together. This is your opportunity to enter into the conversation with Jeff. 74 people from around the world are registered for today's live webinar. This webinar is also being recorded and will be available for download at 1615.org. Again, that's 1615.org in the next week. Jeff, thank you so much for taking time today to share out of your experiences and offer your wisdom to us. I'm going to hand it over to you.
Well, thank you, Matt, and what a blessing and a pleasure it is to be back doing another webinar for 1615. I always enjoy the opportunity and the work that you guys put into making these available. And for those of you that are listening, that are tuning in, I just want to say, hey, you deserve a medal because you've actually chosen to sit in on a webinar having to do with written policy. And although that subject is actually exciting to me, a lot of people, when they hear that, their eyes sort of glaze over and they're like, wow. So the fact that you're tuned in is a beautiful thing, and I think it declares kind of what you were going to unpack here in a few minutes, the reality that you care about God's glory among the nations If policy is a helpful tool for accomplishing that, getting God's name to all people, then it should be taken seriously. And so that's exactly what we're going to do today. So what I want to do is kind of highlight a couple of the purposes for this webinar, and then we'll continue to move through, and as Matt said at the end, we'll take some of the questions that you guys, or some of the questions that might be generated by some of the things that I mentioned. So first of all, we want to, in this seminar, I want to demonstrate why a local church should develop a written missions policy. I mean, the starting point of any, in a sense, action has to be why. Why is much more important than the what and the how. And so we're going to begin with that. Secondly, we'll define what a written missions policy actually is. I'll give you somewhat of a thorough definition of that I think you can run with. And then we'll look at what the multifaceted benefits of a written missions policy are. And I think that's important. That's an important part of this webinar, because I think when people understand not just why a policy should be written, but the multiplicity of benefits of having one, I think it kind of motivates you to move forward with the work that's involved in putting a policy together. And finally, I want to give you some basic concepts, guidelines, and components that are sort of the foundations of what an effective written missions policy looks like. I have been a missionary overseas. I, in fact, was blessed with the opportunity of writing the missions policy for the church I served at as an assistant pastor. Prior to going to the field, my pastor challenged me to write the policy that, in a sense, I would be guided by as I went to the field, and that would guide the church and the missionaries they planned on sending out after I left. And so a lot of what I'm speaking in this webinar is based on personal experience of having gone to the field myself. Then, after coming back and planning a church, developing my own written missions policy. And so with those things in mind, let me go ahead and launch in here. So why should a local church develop a written missions policy? Well, one of the things that I think is important to keep in mind is that local churches develop written policy for specific ministries that they believe are essential and that they view as a crucial expression of the DNA of their church. Now let me kind of unpack that a little bit. You know, if you go to a church and you begin attending there and you decide you want to serve in the children's ministry in response to a plea for people to serve in the children's ministry, that church has a written policy on what it takes to become one of the leaders in the children's ministry. What does it take to actually get in a classroom and to be able to teach kids about God? Any ministry in a local church that the leaders of that local church and the members feel are real important, what they're going to do is they're going to take it seriously enough to develop a policy about it, not just a verbal policy, which a lot of churches navigate by verbal policy in certain areas, but those things that are really important and that the leadership especially feels express their DNA, they write those things down. They want it clear to everybody who wants to be involved or to understand this part of their ministry. They want to make sure it's on paper. What are we trying to accomplish here? How are we trying to accomplish it? And if you want to be part of this important part of our ministry, here's what you got to do in order to be able to engage with our blessing behind you. We're not going to send you down a path that we haven't laid out before you, because what we're trying to accomplish is that important to us. So that's a crucial reason why local churches should develop a written mission policy. And just the bottom line on that specific subject is that, hey, they already have written missions policies for things that are important to them. So when missions becomes important, a written missions policy will always come on their radar screen, and that will be a motivation for them to develop it. Secondly, another reason why is a written missions policy is one of the most practical, useful, effective tools for successful participation in the fulfillment of God's end game purposes. Yeah, believe it or not, a written missions policy, obviously it's practical, it is useful, and it's an effective tool for successful participation. Key word there, successful. If a local church gets a global vision, and they start imparting that vision of God's heart for all nations and that desire to participate in God's end game purposes that we know are unpacked in Revelation 5 and 7 with people from every tribe, people, nation, and tongue worshiping the Lord. If a church wants to participate in that successfully, they're going to see the value of developing a written missions policy. Navigating fully by relationships, fully by personal interaction, although there's much to be said for that, at some point, if God's heart is infused into that church and more people feel the call to go, there needs to be a pathway, not just for the success, not just for the success of the church in sending them, but for the actual successful participation. So a written missions policy is this great tool that helps you to actually succeed at what you say or what the local church says is their end game purpose, which is declaring God's glory among the nations and helping Revelation 5 and Revelation 7 become a reality. So that's a couple reasons why. There are many others, but I think I'll leave it with that for now. What is a written missions policy? What is the definition? So this is one that I've sort of developed over the years, and it's basically a written missions policy is a document, keyword document, that describes the end game goal of the global missions-related ministry of a local church. It's going to describe the principles that shape how that goal will be accomplished, and then the guidelines that are to be followed by the church's missions leaders and those who believe they are called to go out as missionaries. So that's kind of it's a little bit convoluted, but it clearly lays out, what is a written missions policy? Well, it's a document that does those three things: declares the end game goal, it lays out the principles that shape how that goal is going to be accomplished, and then the guidelines, or some people would say procedures. Now let me make a comment on that subject right now. I may scratch on this later, but it's important to understand a lot of times companies or businesses will refer to a policies and procedures manual. Well, what's the difference between policies and procedures? Well, basically policies are sort of the principles, the rules, the guidelines that express the ultimate goal that an organization is trying to accomplish, and then the procedures are the methods or the steps that need to be taken to express the policies, the principles that are there. So you have policies and procedures, and if you think about it, it's sort of like, if you think about the way the New Testament epistles are written, you usually have the first part of an epistle that Paul or one of the other writers has written to a local church or to believers in general, and the first part of it is sort of the theology, who God is, what God's done for you, who you are in Christ, and then because all those things are true, this is how you need to be living. This is what you need to stop doing, this is what you need to start doing, this is how you need to interact with one another. So the policy, you might say, the principles, the guidelines, is sort of the theology, and then the practice that is laid out at the end of the epistles, or sort of halfway through the epistles, the actual practice of how you live out your faith in a policies and procedure manual, you might say. You'll have those two things in the same sequence, the same order. So I think that gives you some clarity on that. You can write that down, or you can pick up the webinar later after we finish. So what are some of the benefits of having developed a written missions policy? Well, over the years, I've discovered quite a few of them, and again, my own background previous to becoming a pastor and being sent to the mission field, I was right out of high school, I went actually into the military. So I served in the U.S. Army, and talk about an organization that has policies and procedures, they have them. And so I was exposed to a world that navigated by policies and procedures as a very high priority. And there are certainly benefits that I saw even as a young man right out of high school with the military navigating according to that kind of policy and procedures. And so I've then seen the benefit over the years to different churches. So here's a few of those benefits. Number one, it declares that this ministry of the church, as I talked about earlier, it declares that this ministry of the church is a very high priority. If somebody looks at a written missions policy, or if they actually find out, hey, they came back from a missions trip, a short-term trip, and they say, hey, you know what, I think God's called me to go serve in a country in Africa, the very fact that their church has a written missions policy is a declaration to that person or anyone else that's paying attention that, boy, missions is a very high priority to this church. Clearly, they put a lot of thought, time, and prayer into creating the pathway for helping somebody discover if they're called, and if they are, how they need to get to the field and what the church is going to do in that process to bless them. So it reveals that. It also reveals that the church leaders expect God to call some of their church's members to go. You know, if you stop and think about that, that's a big one, because what it does, when you write out the missions policy, when the leadership of a local church has seen God's heart for the nations and taken it that seriously, what ends up happening is they're gonna recognize that, hey, if the local church is the primary vehicle through which God wants to make himself known to the nations, then we're probably not just going to send one of our members, that we're going to be a source of people that God can come to, a well that God is going to infuse with his life and his passion, and he's going to draw from our well and send some of our members somewhat regularly to the ends of the earth to be part of his in-game plan. And so having that written missions policy reveals that the church leaders expect God to call some of the church's members to go. And that's important. Third, it instills confidence in the leadership of the church. In other words, it declares to everybody in the church that they aren't sending somebody down a path that they haven't mapped out. If you're going to follow somebody, and again, going back to my time in the military, then my time in the corporate world, when I used to work for manage corporate 7-Elevens, and you go through leadership and management training and so forth. You know, leaders inspire confidence in themselves when the people that they're leading are confident. They know where they're going. They know how to get there. They know exactly what our strategic goal is, what it's going to take to accomplish that goal. They know where we're going. And so what I found is that when a church takes the time to put together a written missions policy, it actually instills a greater confidence in their leadership in the eyes of their church members, because it declares that these guys know where they're going, they know how they want to get there, and I can follow them because they take this seriously. Also, it helps to develop a time to hold on here. Yeah, I left some. Obviously, I left some words out there. But what it does is it also benefits the church in the sense that when you start into the process, when you're sensing God's call to go to the mission field, and you start into the process, you're going to come in contact with, you're going to be in fellowship with the members of the mission leadership team or the missions board, the missions committee. Obviously, the pastors have seen that a written missions policy should be written, and so there's going to be interaction that takes place with missions committee members, the pastors, other members that may serve on the in the leadership roles of the missions department of the church or whatever. But basically, it leads to some great fellowship with like-minded people, and that's always a benefit. Also, it provides a practical and measurable process that lays out the steps that need to be taken by a person who believes that God may be calling them to be a missionary. And I know this is kind of like, a no-brainer, because that's actually what we're trying to do, is lay out a practical, measurable process that lays out the steps. That's very beneficial. People aren't required to come up with their own pathway to the field. There's one that they can follow. It's been thought through. There's practical sides of it. There's theological sides of it. There's knowledge component to it. And it's a process that's measurable. That's a great benefit from a number of different angles, including this next point that I have here. a written missions policy, and this is really important relationally, it serves as an objective screening mechanism that can either help a potential missionary to recognize he may not be called right now, or to assist the missions leaders in the church that need to inform someone of that truth. In other words, one of the things a written missions policy does is it helps those feeling called to go to self-screen. In other words, there are hoops, you might say, that they have to jump through, and as the leadership is observing them going down the path, going through the procedures that are laid out in the policy, they can watch, is this person jumping through the hoops, and have they jumped through the hoops the right way, and so forth. And so what can end up happening is a person who just can't get around to going through the hoops that are included in the written policy is actually screening themselves out. So the leadership, the missions committee people, they don't have to be the ones to say, look, this just isn't happening. They might need to say that, but there's evidence, there's a tool that they've got that's objective that can say, hey, you haven't actually met the requirements that's written in our policy. The timing may not be right. It may not be God's call on your life, at least at this time, or maybe ever. So it's this objective screening mechanism, and what I've seen just practically and totally honestly is a lot of the times a majority of the missionaries will self-screen themselves out, so it doesn't take somebody from the missions leadership team saying to them, look, I don't think you're called to go, at least not yet, and here's the reasons why. They pretty much figure it out themselves as they try to go through the process, and they just don't meet the requirements that are part of the process. So anyway, lots of other benefits too, but I think you get the thrust of that. Now, what are some foundational concepts and components that should be part of a written missions policy? Now, I should also put a declaration out there now to you that primarily what I'm talking about here is a written missions policy for long-term missionaries. Developing a written missions policy for short-term missions is important. Every church should have one of those. But this specific webinar, and most of the churches that I've helped write their missions policy, deal specifically with people who have been on a short-term trip. Now they feel called to go and serve in another country, to actually relocate, leave everything familiar and comfortable behind and move to another country as a missionary. So when I'm talking about a written missions policy, it's important that you should know I'm talking specifically about those that are called to go long-term or relocate to another country for a period of time. So some key concepts that need to be thought about in preparation for writing a written missions policy. Number one, it should be viewed as a tool designed to serve the church and its members, not vice versa. Okay, now a lot of times when I interact with pastors or leaders of churches or even individuals and they hear the word policy, they immediately think of shackles. They think of a whole well thought out system that is against them, and that basically they have to serve the policy. And what we want to do when we write a written missions policy is make sure that we view it as a tool designed to serve the church and its members, not vice versa. And you guys are, I'm sure, somewhat biblically illiterate. It's kind of like the Sabbath, right? You remember Jesus having this interaction with the religious leaders, and he says, listen, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. In other words, he was communicating to these people that had become slaves to the Sabbath. He's saying, look, you guys got this upside down. You got it backwards. God created the Sabbath to be a blessing to you. The Sabbath was created to serve you. You've inverted it, and now you've made yourself servants of the Sabbath. You've made yourself slaves of the Sabbath. And so what we want to do with our written missions policy is approach it the way Jesus said the Sabbath should be approached. It's a blessing. It's a tool. It's a gift that serves us as a local church and those feeling called to go. It's not something that we serve. Secondly, and again, basic. It should be easy to read and as succinct as possible. You don't need a written missions policy that's 25 pages long, single-spaced, okay? Really effective written missions policies can be as short as 4 to 5 pages. Really thought through, really succinct, easy to go through, and the terminology used in the policy should be terminology that, you know, is not like insider jargon kind of stuff. It should be terminology that anybody could read and understand, oh, okay, this is where this church is at in its understanding of missions. It knows exactly where it wants to go. Here's the principles they're going to navigate by. Here's the procedures that somebody that wants to accomplish that ministry of the church, that their goal, this is what they need to do. So it should be easy to read and as succinct as possible, and yet thorough enough to be useful for its intended purpose. I mean, that kind of goes without saying, but it is important. You don't want to have it so short that it's kind of useless. You want to have it thorough enough, but succinct enough that it can actually be that tool that's helpful. Now, okay, here we go. Hold on. A couple other concepts to keep in mind. One of the things that you need to determine if you're going to be part of the team that writes the missions policy for the church in cooperation with the pastor or the leaders of the church, who is the end user of the policy? In other words, you're going to develop this policy. Is it primarily a tool that the missions committee or church leaders are going to use, or is it also something that is going to be given to the potential missionary? And it makes a difference. The way you write, the depth with which you write, the detail that you get into is going to be different for church leaders than it may be for the person who's feeling called to be a missionary. So you want to figure out ahead of time who's the end user of the policy going to be. And some churches that I've worked with, they've actually developed sort of, you know, a very thorough policy that is used by the missions committee or the missions leadership team, very thorough, and then they extract a portion of that, and that's what they would give out to the person, member of their church who's feeling called to be a missionary. But you want to know who that end user is, who's going to be looking at this, who's going to be navigating according to what's written in this document ahead of time. And then also, very important point to consider before you get started is whether the financial or budget aspects related to missionaries, are they going to be included as part of the responsibilities of the leaders who will implement and manage the process described in the policy? In other words, most churches that develop a written missions policy, there's a leadership team or a committee that is sort of navigates in accordance with that policy. And one of the things that you want to determine ahead of time is one of the responsibilities of that committee or that team is one of their responsibilities having to do with distribution of funds. Does the church from its general fund deposit funds into the missions budget, and now the missions committee is able to disperse the funds in the missions budget in accordance with their policy? Or does the policy strictly limited to, you know, vision, philosophy, process for a person to get to the field, but the actual determination of whether the church will give funds to this missionary from its missions budget or from its general fund, or whether this person will have access to the church members to try to raise their funds from the church members. You want to know about those things ahead of time because they're going to make a difference in the way you write the policy, particularly when it comes to the responsibilities of the missions committee or the leadership team. So we may get into that a little bit more as I unpack the rest of this. But those are foundational concepts having to do with developing a written missions policy. And now let me give you a couple of the components having to do with the policy. One of the things that the policy should contain is the overarching vision statement of the church. Okay, so well, not every church. Most churches have a vision statement. And so what you want to do is when you write out your policy, you want to have in there, well, what is the vision of our church? And then ideally, if that overarching vision statement of the church doesn't specifically articulate global missions, you can spring forth from that. In other words, the overarching vision statement of the church may be to win, to disciple, and to send. And then what you want to do is have that in there and then maybe have an add-on as part of the policy to send, including global missions, which is what this policy is written to help accomplish, that sending portion of the vision. Secondly, and this one's really important, and I want to spend a few minutes unpacking this, why, but what is your church's definition of missions? Now, this is kind of a controversial subject these days. It's getting a lot of interest from a lot of people. What is missions? And in fact, it's easily coupled to the who's a missionary. And so what you want to do for your written missions policy is you want to make sure you have a clear definition of what missions is included in your policy so everybody's working from the same page, from the same concept. Now, the reason, and what I've learned to do over the years with the churches that I've helped to write policy is I've worked with missions committees to write the policy, and we help write the policy, and they come up with a definition of missions, and then what ends up happening is the senior pastor or the pastoral leadership is actually propagating on a regular basis a different definition of missions than what's contained in the written policy that we just developed. And so prior to doing all the work of really coming up with a definition for missions and then having everything in the policy sort of flow from that, be the outworking of that definition of missions, you want to find out up front, what does the church, how does the church leadership, especially the pastor, the guys that are in the pulpit, how do they define missions? Now let me give you an example of how I've learned to do this over the years. Most people, if you ask most people in the average congregation here in America, if you would go up to them and say, hey, what is missions? 90% of the people will tell you, well, missions, that's people from our church that God calls to go live in a foreign country and tell Jesus to people that have never heard about him before. In other words, your average churchgoer, when they hear the word missions, the first thing that pops into their mind is somebody that leaves everything familiar and comfortable and goes and lives in another country to expand God's kingdom. What ends up happening is, though, because pastors and church leaders are kind of in the realm of words and concepts and theology, obviously a lot more often than the average church member is, if you then turn around and go to the pastor of the church and say, hey, what's your definition of missions? A lot of times a pastor will say, well, missions is basically reaching out with the gospel. Missions is me being on the radio. Missions is my online program. Missions is the work we do in our local crisis pregnancy center. Missions is the people that we send every week to serve at the jail. Oh, missions is our yearly Halloween alternative outreach on October 31st. Oh yeah, and missions is the people that we've sent to Mongolia. And so you get this conflict, and what I've learned by trial and error, by real life experience, is the missions policy needs to be written in accordance with the way the pastor defines missions. And so when I ask the pastor that question, what is your definition of missions, and he gives me the answer that I just told you, it's kind of any outreach, any exertion of effort by the church to sort of engage those that don't know the Lord and serve its local community or those around the world is missions. What I tell the pastor is, look, if I went and asked your church members to define missions, what would they say? And then I point out to him, I'd say 90% of them wouldn't describe missions at all the way you just described it. They would say missions is having to do with those that actually pack up, have heard a specific call of God, have packed up, left everything behind, and now live in a foreign country to expand God's kingdom. So then what I do is I challenge the pastor or the leaders that I'm talking to with, okay, either you've got to redefine missions for your church because they're not defining it the same way you are, or you need to come up with some different terminology to describe what it is you're talking about in contrast with how they would understand it. So maybe we need to use the terminology domestic missions versus foreign missions. So all of that to say, the definition of missions that your church has specifically that resides in the mind and the heart of the pastor and the leaders, you have to take that into account as you write a written missions policy. Also, you want to make sure that the policy includes a statement of the purpose of the policy. In other words, what purpose does this policy serve for the church at large, for the leaders who implement and oversee the policy, and for those who will step into the path to be guided by it? I know it sounds kind of redundant, it sounds kind of like unnecessary when you first hear it, but it is important that a policy defines its purpose, a statement of the purpose of the policy, and that you think about it in those terms. What's the purpose of this policy for the church at large, for the leaders who implement and oversee it, and for those who will be guided by it? Okay? Now, a couple other key things that should be part of it. There should be a description of the team or group of people that implements or oversees the policy. I've used the terminology a number of times already, the missions committee, the missions board, the missions leadership team, whatever. There needs to be a description of that team or group of people that's going to implement and oversee the policy. Okay, you want to describe it. Is it a team? Is it one person? What is it? Secondly, how is the team structured? In other words, what are the how many members minimum does it have to have? Is there a requirement? Should you have a requirement for team members to have been on a short-term missions trip? How is the team structured? And then kind of bleeding over into the next point, what are the qualifications for being on the team? Does it require to be part of the team? Does somebody have to be a member of the church for a certain length of time? Do they have to have taken a short-term trip? Or is there a requirement to stay on the team, that they take a short-term trip every year and a half or every 2 years, whatever? So you want to determine in the policy what are the qualifications for being on the missions committee or the missions leadership team, and then, and this is where it gets somewhat thorough and you need to be somewhat detailed, what are the responsibilities of the team members? What role do they have, each of them and as a group, in overseeing the policy and the the path that somebody's going to follow? So for example, in the church that I pastored and some of the other policies that I helped churches written, one of the responsibilities of the team members is to interview a potential missionary, an initial interest interview. So it's not the pastors, it's one of the team members who sits down with a church member who took a short-term trip. Now he feels called to go and live somewhere around the world. It's the responsibility of the team members to do that initial interview, to meet with that person, maybe another time or two after that, to assign them a more full application, and then once certain criteria are met, to oversee them during the process. So you want to know what are the responsibilities of the team members. And a couple of things now about the missionary, the person who's feeling called to be a missionary. This needs to be part of the written policy too. What are the qualifications and the course of action, the path, the procedures, you might say, that a potential missionary must follow under the oversight of the team in order to be sent? I talked earlier about the idea of hoops. Maybe that's kind of too harsh or sounds too obstructive. It really isn't. That's not the way I mean it. But there has to be a course of action. There's got to be some signposts along the way that a missionary has to follow, a potential missionary, in order to be commissioned and sent. And it's the responsibility of, or is it the responsibility of the missions leadership team or committee or board to oversee that? In most cases, it is. And in a sense, what ends up happening in a lot of churches is under the oversight of the missions leadership team or committee, this person has went down the path in accordance with the policy. Now the missions committee and team can stamp their approval on the person, and now they can be presented to the actual board of the church as, in a sense, qualified, and that then opens up the other benefits, which are included in the next point, a description of the blessings and benefits that will be bestowed by the church on the missionary who's met the qualifications and completed the process laid out in the policy. So in other words, what you want to do as part of the policy is you want to have, hey, clearly, if you're feeling called to go, we want to send every person that God's truly called to go and confirm their calling. And so we're going to oversee you down a path that we've already laid out. And if you go down the path as we've laid it out, if you meet the qualifications and the criteria that are laid out here, listen, this is the benefit that there's going to be to you. The benefit is going to be that you're going to be embraced as a family member sent out from this church with all of the attention, all of the awareness, all of the love, all of the prayer, and a large portion of financial backing behind you. So in other words, there's a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow that you've got to traverse to get to the field. You want to have that included in there. I've actually seen a few times over the years where, you know, churches have written missions policy. They don't have any of that stuff in there, and then the person goes through all the hoops that are laid out in the policy, and then they find out at the end, oh, well, really, you know, I'm not going to, there's really not a lot of blessings other than I've gone through the process. The church isn't going to support me financially. They're not going to bring me up and pray for me before we go. They're not going to post my newsletters, my bulletins. They're not going to encourage the people to pray for us publicly. So what you want to do is a good written missions policy will lay out and in a sense give the reason why it's worth this person who's feeling called. It gives them the reason why it's worth going down the path, why it's worth jumping through the hoops. And let me make one more comment on that in that realm, and that is when, and again, depending on your type of churches that you've been involved with, a lot of churches will send missionaries out somewhat spontaneously, where somebody takes a short-term trip, they come back 3 or 4 months later, they want to be on the road to go back as a full-time missionary. If you're not coming from that kind of church, this is probably something that you're not really interested in knowing, but if you are coming from a church that kind of, in a sense, navigates spontaneously, you might say, some churches call it being spirit-led, and that those churches a lot of times would view written missions policy as not being led by the Spirit. So what has to happen is you need to think through ahead of time how to communicate to a person that you have a written missions policy and that there's going to be a great benefit to them going through the policy. So here's an example from my own experience when I was pastoring, and one of our church members would come and say, hey, I feel, you know, we did this trip over here, I feel like God's calling me to go here or there. I would say to them, well, praise the Lord, I need to let you know that it's going to be at least a year before we send you out. And a lot of times you will see a change in their demeanor when they say, oh, it's going to take at least a year to send you out. And if that demeanor changes when you give them a time frame like that, and that's not much really in the larger missions world, when you see that happen, you need to communicate to them, as I used to communicate, hey, we love you too much to send you out there unprepared for success, and we love you too much to not prepare ourselves to send you. In other words, think of it as a mother who's you know, conceived. There's a 9-month period where the baby is being prepared to be birthed, and the woman's body is preparing to give birth and then to be able to maintain the baby once the baby is given birth to. So we love you too much to let you go out there unprepared yourself or to send you unprepared ourselves. So if you follow our process that we've clearly thought through, that we've laid out in this policy, man, you're going to be blessed and equipped and prepared for going, and you're going to reap the benefit of us having seen you go through that process and all of the blessings that we want to bestow upon you because you've been obedient to your calling. So I think that lays out sort of the basic components of the concepts and components for written missions policy. I see I'm just about out of my time here for questions. Where do we go from here? I'd love to communicate with you. My email address is on there. There's a lot of great churches that have stuff, but I found the Heritage Baptist Church in Lynchburg. You got their website on there.
Yes.
Great policy stuff on their website under click on ministries and then click on global ministries. So I think that covers it, Matt.
Hey, thank you, Jeff. Really valuable, practical, and encouraging information here. This is your opportunity to interact with Jeff. So a reminder that you can type your questions in the question and answer panel located on the right-hand side of your screen. Jeff, this is from Kyle Poulston. How thoroughly should the church be taught and informed on what the missions policy is?
Oh, that's a great question. I don't think it needs to go much more thorough than just basically letting the church know on a regular basis, hey, we want to participate in what God's doing around the world, and we have a plan and a process that we've developed to help us discover which of you are called to go fulfill God's plans and purposes. And so if something is stirring in you, come and see us. I don't think that on a regular basis, or even maybe there shouldn't be a lot of time and effort put into sharing the written missions policy with the body as a whole, just making sure that the body knows, hey, we have this freeway to the field, but we've already got it mapped out. If you're feeling called to go, be confident that we know exactly where you want to go, and we know how to get you there.
That's good. The questions are rolling in now. This is from Lindsay Hayes. Hi, Lindsay. Jeff, Lindsay is a missions leader at one of the churches I'm coaching in California, and she's also a part of the Perspectives executive team.
Okay.
I wonder what your answer to this question is going to be, Jeff. She says, Matthew, would you suggest churches begin this process if they are currently going through a coaching relationship with 1615, or could this be an outcome from coaching? I'll answer, and Jeff, I want to know what you would answer. I would say, Lindsay,
Okay,
that the process we're going through, what would flow out of this would be the policy, the guidelines, the policies, several components that Jeff hit on. The principles, I would call those values in our context. I think they're very much the same. So Jeff, what's your insight on that question?
I think you're right on, Matt. What you guys do at 1615, using kind of the military terminology is, you're working at the strategic level, and churches need to see things from the bigger strategic level, and then there's the tactical level. And so the written missions policies are going to be birthed out of the strategic level values and missions and so forth. But it is in a sense almost a second process, and you don't want to take that step of writing your written missions policy until you get the strategic values type stuff taken care of, because that's going to influence the way you write your policy.
Absolutely. On that note, I think it's important, it's probably relevant for those who are listening too. Jeff, I've often encountered churches that bring us in for missions coaching, and they have an amazing policy. It's well written, it's biblical, but it's owned by two people. Only two people understand it. Only two people were a part of writing it. They didn't have those strategic pieces in place. One of the things we say at 1615 is that the conceptual leads to the concrete. So,
yes,
kind of that strategic then to the tactical as well. So, Lindsay, one of the outcomes of the coaching process will be the development of policy, and a lot of the things that Jeff hit on today, we will have already articulated those pieces through the coaching process.
and Matt, if I can add to that, a lot of the times in those churches, those policies were written many years ago. There's only a couple of people that know what they are. They're very long. They're kind of tedious to get through, and so a lot of times in the churches that I've helped write policy with, there has to be a willingness, in a sense, to kind of scrap the old policy,
Yep.
and create a new one based on the kind of things that 1615 does in the coaching phase.
Yeah, that is a good point. I've encountered many churches that they take pride in joining the policy, but it's not relevant any longer. No one knows what it is. It's really not even being used in many cases. So that's a great point.
Yeah.
This is from Gordon Ellison. Good last name, Gordon. Jeff, he wants to know, should the policy document include a section on the process of evaluating missionary effectiveness?
That's a great question, and it really depends on, again, how the church leadership envisions the responsibilities of the missions committee. I would say I would always recommend that part of the policy would be, or part of the policy would include, how do you evaluate on-field missionaries with a yearly survey, goals for the new year, did they accomplish last year's goals, all that kind of stuff. I would always recommend they be included in the written missions policy, so the missionary that's following the policy to get to the field, he knows that after he's out on the field for a year, he's going to have some responsibilities to report back to the church. But having said that, although I recommend that, there's some churches that almost make that a separate policy. They've got a policy to get people on the field or to the field, and then they have sort of a mini condensed policy for those that are actually already on the field and the way they interact back with their home church.
It's good. This is from Jonathan Bachman. What are some ways to help convince a church that this is needed if their missions program is non-existent?
Oh, that's a good one. Well, Jonathan, as I said way back in the beginning of the seminar, it really, if the leadership of the church doesn't really have a vision for global missions, you're probably going to spend a lot of time being frustrated writing a written missions policy.
Yeah.
So the missions policy is basically, the fleshing out of a heart that God has grabbed for His glory among the nations, and so you don't want to usurp the order. You want to be praying for your church leaders that God would give them a global mission. You might want to, if given the opportunity, point out one of the points that I made earlier in the webinar, where I said, hey, pastor or leaders or whatever. Do we have a written policy for our children's ministry, for our men's ministry, for whatever other ministries of the church? And if they say yeah, or ask them, maybe the question would be, do we have written policies for any aspects of our church's ministry? Yeah. And whatever they answer with, say, okay, do we have one for global missions? And that might, provoke an interesting conversation. But basically, brother, to write a missions policy that's not the outflow of the leadership vision and heart, yeah, you're setting yourself up for a lot of frustration and potential tension downstream.
Yeah, I think we've hit on this a couple times, Jeff, but I just feel it does need to be reinforced, and that is the leaders have to buy in to the vision. Absolutely. And the procedures and the policy. If the missions policy is only owned by a few people, it really is going to handcuff that team, and they're going to be frustrated. I think it's George Murray who said that the senior leaders of a church, either have the key that unlocks the door to missions, or they have the padlock. I'm probably butchering that quote, but something along those lines, that it's essential to get the senior leaders involved. This is a good one, Jeff. Could you speak to retirement policies in terms of missionary support?
That's a good that's a good question that I think has not been given a proper attention. I think that and under the normal missions paradigm, the things like retirement and even health insurance and so forth, a lot of times those things were in a sense, delegated to the missions agencies. So when a church sent somebody out through a traditional missions agency, the church relied on the fact that that agency has some kind of retirement plan that this missionary is going to be part of. When the local church steps into the role of actually sending direct to the field, or even through those agencies, that is a concern that they need to think about. And it may be that it's important to have it included in the policy, just in a short, maybe even a couple of bullet points, that if your vision is to spend the rest of your career on the mission field, we have requirements for your planned, what are you going to do when you come back from the field in 20 years if things go as you envision. So yeah, I think retirement for a church-based sending direct missions policy, I think having at least a component of it that deals with that issue is important. But if it's more of the traditional route, the policy can merely refer to some reference to, hey, we require that you join the retirement program of the missions agency that you're joining as you go to the field.
That's good. Jeff, this is from Rex Schaffner. Is there anything in the policy that addresses how to address future changes and developments?
That's a really good question, and especially the way technology is changing. I think the main point in the policy is that the policy is amendable by the missions committee or the leadership team, and it can actually be stipulated in the policy that based on current events going on in the world, based on changes in technology and so forth, the commissions committee reserves the right to modify this policy as the need arises. And so if you have that written into the policy ahead of time, you've got the flexibility you need at the time you need it. And that is a really good point, going back to one of the previous points that we were talking about with policies that were written 20 years ago, before email, before Facebook, before social media. When you're talking about printed newsletters and bulletin boards inside churches where something's stapled up there, that whole world has changed, and the missions policy needs to be flexible enough to reflect those changes.
Jeff, something we do with churches that we coach, once they've gone through our process and a strategy has emerged, a vision has emerged, we encourage them periodically, probably every 16 to 18 months, to do a vision refresher, to regroup, to evaluate progress, to celebrate fruit, and to make course corrections as needed. And I would think that would probably be similar with the policy, that there would be a periodic review. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
That's good.
Yes, and even again, having that written into the policy itself, that's one of the components that should be part of the policy. Yeah.
Absolutely. So this is from Steve Scofo, and I hope I didn't butcher your name there, Steve. We support people who do various ministries, parachurch ministry in the U.S., support roles, mobilization, member care, overseas general, and overseas UPGs. When we decided how much to support people, we prioritize UPGs. Is there a way to emphasize this in the document?
Yes, in fact, the policy that I wrote for my church, we had actually priority levels that were written into the document itself. So priority level 1 is our own church members that are going to unreached people groups, and it's tied in with the distribution of the budget. So we got our budget from the overall church budget, and our budget, let's say, was $50,000 for the year. And then what we would do is say, okay, that's the budget we have to work with. Now let's start dispersing it. Priority level 1 is our own members out among unreached people groups, and we designate a percentage of that total amount for them. And then priority level 2 is our own members that are out doing work other than unreached people groups, and they get a certain amount. And then you go down to priority level 3. So yeah, having priority levels and then actually assigning putting parameters on what percentage of the budget goes to those people, having that in the budget is very helpful for everybody involved, both the missions committee and the person that's going to be sent out, so they understand that we make a distinction intentionally about unreached people groups versus the other valid works that are needed out there, but this has to be our highest priority.
This goes back to, Jeff, having a definition of missions that is biblical and that is agreed upon and affirmed by the leaders of the church. I think it helps churches make the decisions whether or not this should even be funded by our
Yes.
budget and strategy. And again, that would work. We're not saying it's not important work, but it may not take into account the multi-ethnic, cross-cultural dimensions of the Great Commission. So I just want to reinforce that having a definition of missions is critical. Otherwise, the budget becomes a catch-all for anything good, altruistic, anything outward, and you end up supporting a lot of good stuff, but it's not missions. So we have more questions here, Jeff, but we've run out of time. So what I'm going to do, those of you who asked questions and we did not have an opportunity to get to them, I will forward a report to Jeff, and he can look at some of those. So I want to take this opportunity to let you know again about some upcoming events at 1615. We have the webinar on stewardship that I mentioned, helping churches leverage their resources for the fulfillment of the Great Commission. What is our role, our responsibility? You can see the dates there. Also, reaching the nations right here, right now. We have an unprecedented opportunity because of immigration and the refugee situation, but also exchange students to share the gospel cross-culturally right here in the United States. April 19th, we hope you join us for that. And once again, the Mission Table, a great resource, provocative topics, critical conversations about missions. We hope you take advantage of that resource. You can listen to archived webisodes or register for upcoming webisodes as well. Jeff, I want to thank you again for taking time. This was a rich time. The things you shared were encouraging, but also instructional, and I'm sure they're going to have impact. This webinar has been recorded. Let me remind you of that. Will be available in about a week at 1615.org. Once again, 1615.org. I'm going to leave the screen up for a little bit if you want to get Jeff's information there, or if you want to learn more about Shepherd Staff Mission Facilitators, please contact him or visit the website. Thank you again, Jeff, and to our live audience, I'm Matthew Ollison for 1615. Thank you so much for listening.